Hey team, recently legendary hedge fund manager Ray Dalio uploaded a 42-minute video called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. This is an intro or promo of sorts for Dalio's new book of the same name. In just over a week, Dalio's book has gotten over 4 million views. He makes a compelling argument for a huge shift in global power that he sees coming, and I respect the guy tremendously. But he would be the first one to tell you to think independently for yourself, and I think Ray Dalio is jumping to some undue conclusions and overlooking some critical flaws in his predictions for the future. TLDR, Dalio thinks the US dollar will lose its reserve currency status and be replaced by the Chinese currency, the Renminbi, or Yuan. But will it?
I don't believe the Renminbi will be a viable reserve currency quickly. But I do believe it'll happen much faster than anybody expects.
P.S. The renminbi is the currency of China and the yuan is the denomination, but I'm going to use those words more or less interchangeably here. Now, if you don't know much about Dalio, it's worth considering who this guy is. Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, which today is the world's largest hedge fund with over $100 billion in assets under management. Dalio founded Bridgewater in 1975. The firm is now 47 years old and Dalio is 72. He's been renowned throughout his career as one of the most innovative minds in the financial world. In 2017, Dalio published a book called Principles, Life and Work, outlining his lessons that have produced such huge and consistent results for him and Bridgewater. Principles was a huge hit, a bestseller, still on Amazon. I've read it and I highly recommend it. And this new book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, it takes some of those ideas and focuses them for our present situation as Dalio sees it. And a lot of what Dalio sees overlaps heavily with what diehard Bitcoiners have been saying for over a decade. The idea is simple, if a bit grim for the Americans out there. He's studied the history of currencies and empires, and he's picked up on some patterns that seem to repeat themselves. First, when faced with a crisis, governments spend a lot of money. Because of that spending, in time, they either have to rein in their spending, which is really hard to do, but ultimately more healthy and sustainable, or they can just print more money, which is easy to do in a moment of crisis, but ultimately ruinous for a nation's currency and power. And every time governments are faced with this choice, every single time, they will choose to print the money because it's easier and they can pass the buck to the next monarch or administration or generation. FDR did this in 1933. Richard Nixon did this in 1971. Many governments have done this, spanning centuries, arguably millennia. Arguably every government ever faced with the prospect of reining in spending or printing more money, they always print the money. I think we're all on the same page with Dalio so far. Second, all of that money printing creates huge inequality in society. We've all heard the phrase, the rich get richer. It's true, and it happens a lot of different ways. Rich people with valuable assets are seen as a good bet by lenders, so they get access to absurdly cheap loans and other financial deals. They pass their wealth onto their children and ensure that their children get really great education, so their wealth can persist down generations. But the most insidious way this inequality happens is through something called the Cantillon effect. Dalio doesn't talk about this in his video explicitly, but it's a very real thing and something I'm sure he's familiar with. When governments create money in a crisis, they don't just say, "Quick, get this cash into the hands of the neediest, most destitute people in our country." Even if there's an emergency and all of their rhetoric is about supporting the average person, that's not their main goal. The real threat is the collapse of institutions, and that's what crisis measures are meant to address. So newly created money goes through the financial system, and who sees that money first? Bankers and the financial class. And when they get it, inflation has not really happened yet. That money hasn't spread through the economy. Its effects have not been felt. So the first ones to receive and spend it, they get the full benefit, the most value from that new money. By the time it moves through the economy and ends up in Joe Nobody's measly bank account, that's when inflation will have already set in. Prices will have risen, and Joe Nobody doesn't get any benefit from all of that new money in the economy. If he gets a raise or additional income at all, it's simply eaten up by the increased cost of living. It probably doesn't even cover the $35 overdraft fee from his account that was only overdrawn $3 to begin with. And now Joe is angry.
Rent, it's too damn high.
He knows this whole economic game is rigged against him, even if he doesn't know exactly how it's rigged. He's angry, and there are a lot of people like Joe, and this turns into huge domestic instability, with growing tensions between the haves and the have-nots. Third, government overspending and growing internal strife, along with a bunch of other related, complicating, and ugly trends, lead to a dominant economic empire collapsing and a new empire rising to take its place. This is the changing world order that Dalio is talking about with his video and book. Over the past 400 years, there have been several dominant empires with their dominant currencies that have risen, held power, fallen, and been replaced, and Dalio lays them out very clearly. The Dutch with their currency, the guilder, then the British and the British pound sterling. Dalio thinks that the declining empire right now is the United States, along with the US dollar as the reserve currency. He proposes we should expect to see next the ascent of the Chinese empire and the Renminbi currency taking global center stage as the next reserve currency. We've talked a bit about the US dollar as the reserve currency on this channel before, and the topic could really fill libraries, but it's important to emphasize something here. Having your nation's currency accepted as a global reserve is incredibly powerful. It's basically a cheat code. In 2018, 88% of international transactions involved the US dollar. Now, those are mostly transactions where the US is not one of the trading parties. Countries in South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, all are using US dollars in their international trade for anything and everything, from coffee to gold, and probably most importantly, oil. The country that controls the reserve currency will be wealthy and prosperous almost by default. Think about it. These countries are trading fundamentally useful and valuable goods like oil that literally fuels the global economy, and in return the US is paying in dollars that were created out of nothing. That is absolutely a cheat code, an unfair advantage. But running with the metaphor, other people won't be too pleased if you're always using a cheat code, and they're going to try to find ways to not play with you anymore. So remaining a reserve currency is by no means guaranteed, and when one currency falls, something has to take its place in international trade. Okay. Dalio is right about most of what he says here. There is a clear pattern of succession, with one empire and currency rising, holding the center for an average of 95 years, then being replaced. And you don't need to look far to see where the US is declining. Internal division is at a generational high for sure. There have been riots not just in the past couple years, but large-scale protests going back over a decade, to the Tea Party protests, or Occupy Wall Street, or Black Lives Matter. There are ups and downs, but the general trend of discontent from Main Street America seems to be going up, at least in my lifetime. And internationally, the United States is not the same shining city on a hill it once was. The Cato Institute issues a freedom index indicating the individual liberty a person can expect to enjoy in different countries. For 2021, the US was number 15, behind the UK, Canada, Scandinavian countries, and more. The US military is overstretched and showing how thin it is. Afghanistan was occupied by American troops for 20 years at a cost of $2.3 trillion, and the US withdrawal was catastrophic. Nobody particularly thinks the US is still an ascending power. And importantly, when we're talking about empires, a key consideration is their currency. US dollar inflation is now at a 40-year high, officially at 7.5%, but much higher if you use older metrics. So that's what we agree on. But where I think Dalio might be presuming way too much is looking to China as the clear next empire and backer of the reserve currency. I have not read his book, not yet, I will, but in this video at least, he lays it out like a foregone conclusion. China will sit at the center of the global economy. It's had explosive growth over the past 40 years. Poverty is down, GDP is up. The 21st century will be the Chinese century. Okay, but there are some things that don't line up here, even according to Dalio's own account. And while Dalio is brilliant, there are other brilliant minds who do not agree with him on this. Let's look at some of the reasons Dalio may be wrong, and what alternatives exist. First, the reason sovereign nations will choose another nation's currency to hold in their reserves and use in international trade is simple: stability and trust. When two parties are making a deal for a huge transaction that will span years, they don't want their currency swinging wildly in value. Stability matters, even if that means using somebody else's money. And trust. Is the group issuing this money doing so in good faith? Are they going to screw with the system to unfairly advantage themselves? When the US dollar became the reserve currency, World War II had just ended, the United States was instrumental in defeating Hitler, and the dollar was backed by precious metals. This looked like a government that would be good to trust. But since at least 1971, dollars have continued to inflate, losing value, especially in the last couple years. The US government and the Federal Reserve have screwed with the system to unfairly advantage themselves, and other governments are understandably looking elsewhere. But is Chinese currency better? Another billionaire investor, Stan Druckenmiller, doesn't think so. Druckenmiller agrees with Dalio that the dollar is in decline and will likely lose its reserve status.
Are you comfortable saying what you said there, that for the first time in your career, you think we lose reserve status?
I'm comfortable with it. That's my central case. As you know, Joe, I can change my mind. But I think it's more likely than not, within 15 years, we lose reserve currency status.
But will the yuan take the dollar's place? To quote Druckenmiller, who's going to trust the Chinese government?
Who's going to trust the Chinese?
Let's elaborate some, shall we? There are very good reasons to be skeptical of the Chinese Communist Party as the steward of the global reserve currency. First, there are currently heavy controls on how much yuan can actually leave China for other countries. They could change that, but so far, there just isn't enough yuan out there in the world to pose a real threat to the dollar. That's probably part of why the yuan only represents 2% of global reserves right now. And you know who doesn't like capital controls? Capitalists. This is one of the things Dalio talks about in his video.
And when the rich fear their wealth and well-being will be taken away, they move to places, assets, and currencies they feel safer in.
Capital flees when governments try to control it. It flees to other jurisdictions, assets, and currencies. This is happening in China right now, and it's probably a big reason why they don't like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. The wealthy can use crypto to expatriate their money, and the government can't control it. The Chinese government is also inflating their currency. If you're looking for long-term stability in a global reserve currency, this isn't it. The investment banker and author on monetary history, Jim Rickards, agrees. China is not ready to take on the reserve currency.
I don't want to get into the weeds on China's internal monetary policy. I could, except to say that they're grossly over-leveraged. The economy is investment driven, not consumption driven. They're about 40%, 45% investment. The U.S. is about 25% investment. So that gives you some idea of how investment is to the Chinese, which is actually okay if you're investing in productive assets that pay the way. They're not. They're wasting the money.
Also, and I think this is the obvious thing that the cable news shows don't want to talk about, this is an authoritarian regime. The concept of private property and individual rights barely get a nod from the CCP. Rule of law? The law is whatever the party dictates. I mean, this is the same government that is implementing a social credit system to keep their citizens in line. If you drink too much alcohol, play too many video games, are rude to people in public, your social credit score and access to society will drop. This is literally the plot of a Black Mirror episode. It's the same government that's operating an actual concentration camp for people who don't renounce their religion and heritage and culturally line up.
Did someone take a huge risk in leaking these documents?
In Xinjiang, people have been sentenced to death for much less.
The recent Beijing Winter Olympics were a nightmare for a variety of reasons and the lowest rated Olympics in living history.
I wish the athletes well. I do not encourage them to speak out against the Chinese government there because I fear for their safety.
Have we all forgotten about the Evergrande fiasco? Just 5 months ago, the massive Chinese company was so over-leveraged that there was widespread and open speculation that its collapse could trigger a global economic meltdown. This is a government that has brazenly coordinated corporate espionage for decades, infiltrating and stealing as much proprietary information from overseas as possible, completely violating any sense of international trust or goodwill. And the Chinese government is planning to issue a digital yuan, and frankly, this is an actual dystopia they're talking about. Proponents talk about how fast and efficient it is, but who wants to be quickly and efficiently controlled and surveilled? Because, make no mistake, this is surveillance and coercion writ large. I don't even feel like we can call it currency, because the units are not fungible or interchangeable. These are coupons attached to your account issued by the government and subject to whatever changing terms that government sets unilaterally, and users have no say in the matter. Use it or live in a cave cut off from society and starve to death. I'm actually not even sure that they would let you do that if you wanted to. This is the government that Dalio thinks is the de facto winner for the next global empire and reserve currency. Okay, well, if the US dollar is declining and the Chinese government and yuan are riddled with irreconcilable problems, what's the alternative? Come on, you know what I'm gonna say. I don't even have to say it. The next reserve currency might be the euro. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. It's not gonna be the euro, and it's probably not gonna be gold for that matter. Both of those have myriad problems and nobody is really floating them as viable competitors, but it might be Bitcoin. This, of course, has been the dream and rally cry of Bitcoin maximalists for years, that it was inevitable that Bitcoin will ascend to become the world's money, and the early adopters will be rewarded handsomely, and sound money will reign. No individual nation will be able to inflate the currency because the supply is truly limited. Maybe that will happen, and there's an argument to be made that if Bitcoin can go from zero to its current market cap of $750 billion, then it can certainly go from where it is today to the reserve currency. But here's the thing. I'm going to throw an idea out there. Ignoring the fact that this would make large Bitcoin holders like Michael Saylor the wealthiest people in history, Bitcoin being perfectly sound money might be too perfect. It's inflexible. The supply cannot expand, and governments, frankly, might not like that. What I think might be more likely is a basket of cryptocurrencies. And this is still very much a vague idea, but I'm not the first to mention it. We've already talked about Stan Druckenmiller's skepticism about the Chinese yuan. In that same interview, he suggested that cryptocurrency could replace the US dollar.
Europe is a complete mess. Who's going to trust the Chinese? 5 or 6 years ago, I said that crypto was a solution in search of a problem. Well, the problem has been clearly identified. It's Jerome Powell and the rest of the world's central bankers. There's a lack of trust.
Druckenmiller is suggesting a new cryptocurrency, but Mark Carney, who is the governor of the Bank of England, suggested a basket of cryptos. This gets complicated really fast, and the future, as ever, is murky and subject to chaotic forces that are very hard to predict. Maybe there will be multiple dominant reserve currencies, as Jerome Powell has suggested. Maybe it'll be Bitcoin straight up. That would be pretty amazing for all of us laser eyes on Twitter. Maybe it will be a basket or index of existing or new cryptos. That's my best bet. But for Dalio to say that it's going to be the yuan, and to say it so confidently, with no caveats or disclaimers, with no criticism of the Chinese Communist Party, without so much as a mention of liberal Western values around freedom and individual liberty, I think he's severely overestimating how many people and countries will want to get on board for a Chinese government reserve currency. That's it, team. What do you think? Will the US dollar lose its place as the reserve currency, or is it still the best bet for the foreseeable future? Will Bitcoin fulfill its destiny and ascend to become the global money it was always meant to be? Will a basket of cryptos be reserve? And what else do you want to talk about? What should we discuss in the next video? Let me know down in the comments, and we will cover it all in a future video. Thanks, team.